In a blistering live Senate showdown in Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett confronts John Kennedy over a broken retirement system that has condemned over 32 million Americans, especially poor women, to poverty in old age. Kennedy thunders about a $31 trillion debt and the collapse of the economy. But Crockett fires back like a blade through marble, naming names, citing nations like Sweden and Denmark, where dignity doesn't expire with age. The chamber turns into a war zone of ideologies. Then Kennedy lashes out, calling her a reckless idealist playing with fire. And in that breathless moment, Jasmine responds with one line so devastating, it doesn't just end the debate, it shakes the foundation of the room. What truth did she unleash that left even her loudest enemies in stunned, terrified silence? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The spotlight shone on the grand halls of the U.S. Capitol as millions of Americans tuned in for the highly anticipated hearing on the fairness of the U.S. retirement system. At the heart of this debate stood Jasmine Crockett, a passionate congresswoman from Texas, known for her fierce advocacy for working-class Americans and women's rights. With a reputation for fighting systemic injustice, Jasmine had taken on a mission to reform the retirement system she saw as unfair, leaving the vulnerable to face an uncertain future. Opposing her was John Neely Kennedy, the seasoned senator from Louisiana, who stood firmly in defense of the current system. Known for his staunch belief in fiscal conservatism and government restraint, Kennedy viewed the growing retirement burden as unsustainable. For him, the government couldn't afford the expansive costs of the current system, and he believed the nation's economic stability depended on limiting its spending. As both figures took their positions in the hearing room, it was clear that the battle ahead would be intense. Crockett, fighting for justice and equality, and Kennedy, championing economic pragmatism, were about to clash over the future of millions of Americans. The outcome of this debate would decide whether the system would remain unchanged or be reformed to ensure fairness for all. The room held its breath as Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, her presence commanding attention. The lights overhead cast shadows across her determined face. They couldn't dim the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just a congresswoman now. She was a voice for those who had been silenced for far too long. Every word she spoke, every breath she took, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 struggles that had been ignored for generations. The time for compromise had ended. This was her moment to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made the powerful forces in the room. The current retirement system is a deep and undeniable injustice, she began, her voice steady yet fierce. It's a system that has turned its back on the very people who built this country, the people who wake up every day and give their blood, sweat, and tears to keep the wheels of this nation turning. And when they finally reach the end of their working lives, what do they get? A system that was never meant to help them. A system that has left them destitute, forgotten, and abandoned. There was a quiet shift in the room, a ripple of recognition that spread like a wave. Every eye was on Jasmine, hanging on her every word. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room as she delivered her next words with deliberate force. Low-income workers and women are the backbone of this country. They put in the hours, they fight every day for a paycheck, and they contribute more to our economy than anyone else. Yet they are the first to be left behind when it comes time to retire. This system has failed them, and we cannot continue to ignore it. Her voice was growing in strength now, almost vibrating with emotion. This system was not created to protect them. It was created to protect the wealth of a few, to secure the fortunes of the privileged while pushing the rest to the margins. The people who build this country, the janitors, the factory workers, the nurses, the teachers, they are the ones who are left to suffer. They contribute significant portions of their income into the system, and yet when they are ready to retire, they are left to face the harsh reality of poverty and uncertainty. She stepped forward slightly, her voice now charged with a sense of urgency. How is this fair? How is this acceptable? These are hard-working individuals who have sacrificed so much, yet they are the ones left with the scraps when they need it the most. And what do they get in return? A broken promise, a promise that was supposed to offer them security, A promise that has turned into a lie. The words poured out, sharp and unforgiving. The room seemed to grow heavier with each sentence, the weight of the truth sinking in. We cannot continue to sit idly by and let this injustice thrive, she continued, her tone unwavering. We cannot allow corporate elites to hoard their wealth while the people who make this country run are left to struggle. We cannot continue to allow our retirement system to be an afterthought for those who can't afford to retire. This system must be fixed, not tomorrow, not next year, but right now. We owe it to the workers, the mothers, the fathers, the families who built this nation. Her words rang in the air like a bell tolling for the dead. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just making a policy argument. She was declaring war on a system that had failed those who needed it most. The truth is simple, she said, her voice now calm but filled with determination. The workers of this nation, particularly the most vulnerable, have been abandoned. And it is time to bring fairness to a system that has been rigged for far too long. They've paid their dues. They deserve a future that honors their sacrifices. The chamber was still. Every word she said seemed to echo through the room. Jasmine's fiery passion had ignited something, a realization, a spark. The gravity of her words was undeniable, but more than that, the truth she spoke was one that everyone in that room could feel, whether they were ready to admit it or not. I stand here today for those who can't, Jasmine concluded, her voice ringing with a finality that left no room for doubt. For the ones who have been forgotten, for the ones who have been left behind. The people of this country deserve better, and we must give it to them. A fair system that supports every worker, every woman, every person who has contributed to this country. It's time we fix what has been broken for too long. The room held its breath as Jasmine Crockett's words reverberated in the air. The heavy silence that followed her opening remarks was not one of agreement, but of discomfort. The kind of discomfort that comes from confronting an undeniable truth that had been buried for far too long. She wasn't just making a political statement. She was exposing a deep and painful injustice that had been systematically ignored. She paused, took a deep breath, and then continued, her voice steady but packed with the force of everything she had witnessed in her time fighting for the working class. Let's talk about the cold, hard truth, she began, her voice slicing through the quiet with laser-like precision. According to research from the Social Security Administration, over 40% of low-income workers rely solely on Social Security to survive after they retire. But do you know what that means? It means they are living with the bare minimum, a system that's barely enough to keep them from slipping into absolute poverty, let alone live with any sense of dignity. She emphasized each word, her gaze piercing, locking eyes with the committee members, daring them to look away from the truth she was laying bare. These aren't just statistics, she pressed on, her voice growing louder, her passion more evident with each passing sentence. These are real people, hard-working men and women who have spent their entire lives contributing to this system. Yet when it's time for them to finally rest, to take their well-earned place in the later years of their life, what do they get? Nothing. A meager stipend, a check that doesn't even cover their most basic needs. They've spent decades paying into the system, and yet they are betrayed by the very system they helped build. The room seemed to tighten with each word she spoke, as though the walls themselves were closing in, forcing those present to confront the harsh realities she was describing. Jasmine's voice never wavered. She was a force of nature now, a woman driven by a fury that had been simmering for years, watching as those who deserved protection were cast aside. The system is failing them, she said, her words now hammering against the walls of the room. And it's been failing them for far too long. We have workers, good, hardworking people, who cannot retire in peace because they've never had the opportunity to save. They've worked their entire lives only to find that their final years are spent in financial ruin. How is that fair? Her eyes burned with the fire of righteousness as she continued, her words now hammering against the walls of the room, each one packed with indignation and truth. And you want to know what else is unfair? She asked, leaning forward slightly, her tone dripping with fury. It's the fact that the very wealthiest among us, the ones who can afford to not only live comfortably, but thrive, are paying nothing into the system that the rest of us are relying on. The system that is supposed to serve the people, and yet it serves the wealthy and the corporations. The working class is paying the price, and they are being left with nothing. The room was deathly silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone in the chamber. Jasmine's voice cracked slightly as she added, "These aren't just numbers I'm reading off a page. These are lives, real lives, families, mothers and fathers who spend their final years wondering if they'll have enough money for food, for medicine, for basic shelter." The emotion in her voice was raw, unfiltered, and it struck like lightning in a dry field. The committee members who had once sat comfortably behind their papers were now riveted by the intensity of her conviction. "And for what?" she demanded, her eyes scanning the room. "For a system that benefits those at the top, while the people who make this country run are left to scramble for whatever crumbs are thrown their way? The people who are holding this country together are the same ones who are being denied a fair retirement. How long are we going to stand by and let this happen?" Jasmine paused, her chest rising and falling as she took a deep breath. She could feel the anger and disgust building up in her chest, but it wasn't just anger. It was the anger of millions of people who had been waiting for someone to speak for them, to fight for them. And today, that someone was Jasmine Crockett. "The truth is simple," she said, her voice softer now, but carrying a weight that demanded attention. "These people are being betrayed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. And I am here today to tell you that enough is enough. We cannot continue to allow this system to exist in its current form. We must fix it. We must create a system that truly serves the people, especially the ones who have given everything to keep this country moving forward." The chamber was silent as her final words hung in the air, unmistakable in their power. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just making a policy argument, she was making a moral demand, and the truth she spoke was undeniable. The room, heavy with anticipation, shifted as John Kennedy rose to speak. His demeanor was calm, almost detached, as he carefully adjusted his notes and then looked directly at Jasmine Crockett. He was a man known for his stoic resolve, a senator who believed in the power of hard truths, even if those truths were uncomfortable. And in this moment, Kennedy was prepared to lay out a harsh reality, one that Jasmine's impassioned plea had yet to address. As his gaze met hers, there was no sense of fear or hesitation in his eyes. This was a battle of ideologies, and Kennedy was certain of his ground. "Jasmine," he began, his voice measured, but carrying the weight of someone used to commanding attention. "I hear your calls for fairness, for justice, but the truth is not as simple as you make it out to be." He paused briefly, letting the tension in the air build before delivering his first blow. "The retirement system we have today is a cornerstone of our economy. It provides a safety net for millions of Americans who've worked hard their entire lives. It's not perfect, but it is essential. Without it, the very fabric of our society would begin to fray." The weight of his words hung in the room. Kennedy wasn't just defending a policy, he was defending a belief system that had underpinned much of his political career. But what he said next cut through the air like a sharp blade. "However, Jasmine, I cannot sit here and allow you to keep pushing this dream, this vision of a utopian system that the country cannot afford." His tone hardened, his gaze unwavering. "The national debt is already $31 trillion, and it's growing every day. The system as it stands is no longer sustainable. We cannot continue to carry the burden of a broken system when the costs are spiraling out of control." Kennedy's words were deliberate, and his conviction undeniable. "You talk about fairness, but what I hear is a fantasy. You want to expand this system, increase its costs, and do it without any real plan for sustainability. If we keep spending at this rate, we will reach a point where we can't fund the very services that millions of Americans depend on. If we don't cut costs now, this country will be left with nothing but empty promises and a collapsed economy." He leaned in slightly, the weight of his argument pressing down on the room. The room had gone silent, all eyes locked on him. "This isn't just about politics," Kennedy continued, his voice gaining in intensity. "This is about the survival of our nation. We're facing an economic storm, and if we don't act to reduce the cost now, we'll all be swept away." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before he threw his next punch. You cannot continue to dream of a retirement system that is untouchable, Jasmine, without facing the financial realities of this country. You cannot keep asking for more without recognizing that taxpayers, the very people you claim to fight for, will be the ones who foot the bill. His eyes locked onto hers, the challenge clear in his expression. The government cannot keep printing money to cover a system that's running out of funds. It's irresponsible, it's unsustainable, and it's dangerous. Kennedy stood tall, his face unyielding, as if daring anyone in the room to challenge his logic. His voice dropped, but the force was undeniable. We are not in a position to gamble with the future. The cost of these programs is already putting us in grave danger, and I will not sit by and watch you push this country to the brink. But as Kennedy spoke, the tone of his words shifted subtly, the cynicism creeping in. Frankly, Jasmine, you've got this idealistic idea of what this country can be, but you haven't looked at the facts. You're out here throwing around proposals like you're playing with monopoly money, and it's all just a pipe dream. You're so focused on making yourself sound righteous, but you're ignoring the fact that real governance is about facing the hard truths. His voice dripped with disdain as he leveled the final jab. It's almost cute to watch you believe this can all be solved with a wave of a magic wand, but that's not how it works in the real world. He was a man grounded in pragmatism, and his approach to this debate was a reflection of that. Hard-hitting, no nonsense, and aimed directly at what he believed to be the heart of the problem. The system is already burdened by a national debt that threatens to bankrupt us all. The truth is simple, he continued, his voice now carrying the weight of years of experience. We must act now. We must reduce the costs of these programs and reform the system, or else we risk tearing apart the very foundation of our economy. The room was still, the intensity of the moment hanging thick in the air. Kennedy's argument was powerful. There was no denying the financial reality he was presenting, but even as his words left an impression, there was an unmistakable tension. The clash of ideals between him and Jasmine Crockett was now more evident than ever. The stage had been set for the true battle to unfold, but it was clear. Kennedy was fighting to save a system that he believed could still be salvaged, while Jasmine was fighting to change a system that had already failed too many. So, Jasmine, Kennedy concluded, his voice cold and resolute, you cannot continue to push for reform without first confronting the reality of this country's financial situation. Dreaming of a perfect system won't fix what's broken. It will only drive us further into debt. And when that happens, no one, least of all the people you claim to protect, will be safe. The room fell into a deep silence, the air thick with the weight of economic reality and political ideology clashing in real time. Kennedy had thrown down the gauntlet, and now the question was, how would Jasmine respond to his stark, undeniable truth? The tension in the room was palpable as Jasmine Crockett stood tall, eyes burning with a mix of frustration and determination. The weight of her words settled in the air, thick and heavy, as she locked eyes with John Kennedy and the rest of the committee. She had listened to his defense of the status quo, heard his arguments for fiscal responsibility and economic survival, but she wasn't about to let that mask the deep inequities that had been allowed to fester in the system for far too long. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she prepared to unleash the heart of her argument. Let's talk about the tax system, the system that has been rigged for decades to protect the wealthy and the powerful at the expense of the very people who build this country. She began, her voice unwavering. For too long, this country has allowed the richest corporations to get away with paying nothing, while those who work hardest are burdened with the highest tax rates. Her words were deliberate, sharp, and precise, each one designed to strike a blow at the heart of the inequality she was fighting against. The room hung on her every word as she spoke the uncomfortable truth. Let's take Amazon as an example, she continued, her voice rising with urgency. In 2018, Amazon, the largest online retailer in the world, made $11 billion in profits, and yet they paid $0 in federal taxes. Do you know how much the average worker who spends their entire life paying into this system gets to keep? About 25% of their paycheck goes straight to the government. The same government that lets these massive corporations walk away without contributing a single dime. Her eyes flared with intensity as she made her next point. This is the crux of the issue. The working class Americans, the people who keep this country running, are forced to pay taxes at a rate far higher than the wealthiest corporations. Amazon pays zero. Walmart pays a fraction of what they should. But the everyday person, they get hit with the full brunt of the tax burden. How is that fair? How is that even remotely just? The committee members shifted in their seats. The stark contrast between the massive profits of corporations and the struggling workers became undeniable. Jasmine's voice broke through the silence, gaining momentum as the anger she felt for those who had been exploited and left behind fueled her words. You have billionaires and corporate CEOs with their private jets, their luxurious mansions, and yet the people who work on the ground, the janitors, the teachers, the nurses, the ones who make this country run, are left to scrape by on their bare minimum. They're the ones forced to pay into a system that has failed them, and the wealthiest walk away, untouched, unscathed, free of responsibility. Her breath caught as the weight of her own words settled over her. This isn't just about tax rates. This is about fairness. This is about dignity, Jasmine continued, her voice now a controlled fury. The wealthy don't contribute their fair share, while the poor and middle class are forced to carry the entire financial burden. The irony is staggering. These wealthy corporations get tax breaks, enjoy the fruits of government policies, and then turn around and contribute nothing to the very system that supports them. She paused for a moment, letting the intensity of her argument sink in. The silence in the room was almost suffocating, the weight of what she had said hanging in the air. But Jasmine wasn't finished yet. And the truth is, these corporate giants are not only avoiding taxes, they are exploiting the system to the fullest extent. They play the game by exploiting loopholes in tax law, using legal technicalities to get out of paying their fair share, all while hardworking people are forced to carry the load. The room seemed to pulse with the reality of what she was laying out. And who pays for that? Jasmine's voice dropped, but her words landed like a hammer. It's the people who work with their hands. The truck drivers, the factory workers, the teachers, the cashiers, the people who are making this country run. They are the ones who end up with the short end of the stick, paying more in taxes than the largest corporations in the world. Her voice grew louder as she made her final point. So, Mr. Kennedy, you want to talk about a sustainable system, but we have to ask ourselves, what kind of system allows corporations to skip out on their responsibilities while the working poor are left to fend for themselves? What kind of country are we when billionaires pay nothing and the people who do the real work are left to face the brunt of it all? Jasmine's words hung in the air, her stance unwavering, her gaze piercing. There was no denying the injustice she had just exposed. Her voice, strong and resolute, reverberated through the room as she concluded, "It's time we fix this broken system. It's time we stop letting the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. We cannot continue this disgraceful cycle." The silence in the room was deafening. Every word she had spoken, every fact she had laid bare, had hit its mark. Jasmine had just flipped the narrative, forcing everyone in the room to confront the uncomfortable truth that for far too long, the system had been tilted in favor of the few, while the many had borne the brunt. In that moment, there was no question. Jasmine had set the stage for a decisive shift, and the fight for fairness had only just begun. The room grew heavier with the weight of Jasmine Crockett's words. She had just launched a bold challenge to the very core of the system, but she wasn't finished. The frustration building inside her was a reflection of the real stories, the unheard voices that were the true victims of this broken system. As she paused, she took a breath, her gaze sharpening, the next part of her argument set to strike with pinpoint precision. "Let's be clear," Jasmine began, her voice steady but charged with a quiet fury. "Women are not just facing a pay gap, they are facing a life gap, a gap that only widens as they grow older. And if you don't see that, Senator, if you can't acknowledge that, then you're blind to the reality of the situation." She allowed the words to hang in the air for a moment, letting the gravity of what she was saying settle in. She wasn't merely discussing inequality in theory, She was calling out the devastating truth that far too many people refuse to face. Women are forced to work harder for less, and when they get older, when they should be able to retire with dignity, they are left with nothing. It's a cruel, unforgiving system, Jasmine continued, her voice growing more intense. The system tells them to work, to contribute, to sacrifice for their families, and then what happens? When they finally reach the end of their working years, they have nothing to show for it, nothing but a handful of crumbs that won't even cover their basic needs. Her words began to cut through the tension like a knife, each sentence landing with the power of truth. The room, once quiet, now seemed to feel her every word, the tension growing as she wove the harsh reality of women's lives into the debate. Jasmine's gaze remained fixed, unwavering, her anger and frustration rising with every word she spoke. "But it's not just the pay gap," she said sharply, shaking her head. "Women are living longer than men, but they're not given the tools to survive in their later years. The result? A future of poverty and insecurity." The room fell into a deeper silence, the quiet intensity only broken by the steady rhythm of Jasmine's voice, rising with each moment. "You can't deny the numbers, Senator. The Economic Policy Institute's research is clear. Women's retirement savings are 30% lower than men's. 30%. And why is that? Because women are paid less. They're expected to work longer for fewer benefits. And then, when it's time to retire, they are forced to rely on a broken system that isn't designed to support them. So I ask you, Senator," Jasmine said, her tone growing sharper with each passing second, "how long will you continue to ignore these realities? How long will you continue to defend a system that disadvantages women at every turn?" Her voice quivered with a righteous anger that could no longer be contained, each word emphasizing the unequal burden that women were forced to carry. Women are not just fighting for equal pay, they're fighting for security, for peace of mind in their later years. And yet your policies continue to push them further into poverty and instability, leaving them to struggle when they should be able to retire with the dignity they've earned through a lifetime of work. Her words struck like a hammer on an anvil, the righteous fury in her voice reflecting the frustration of millions of women who had been ignored, overlooked, and denied what they deserved. How many more women will have to die broke, forced to choose between medicine or food in their later years? How many more have to sacrifice their health and happiness to survive, only to face financial ruin when they can no longer work? She paused briefly, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her emotions. "Senator, this is not about politics. This is about justice. The injustice faced by women in this country is something that should have been addressed decades ago. But here we are, still debating it, still allowing women to be pushed to the margins of society when it's time for them to retire." Jasmine's voice softened, but the power behind it never wavered. It's time to stop talking about these problems like they're abstract concepts. These are real people. These are real lives, lives that are being affected every single day by the policies that are supposed to protect them. Her final words were a challenge to every member of the committee, a challenge to all those who would continue to defend a broken system. We can't keep ignoring the inequality that women face. We can't keep letting them suffer because the system is too comfortable to change. It's time to act. It's time to fix this. The silence in the room was deafening. Jasmine had laid bare the unfairness, the discrimination, and the devastating toll that the current system had on women. And now the world would have to reckon with it. The pause between Kennedy's last breath and his next volley was calculated. Not hesitation, but control. A silence soaked in tension gripped the hearing room as he leaned forward, eyes locking on Jasmine Crockett with unnerving precision. "I'm not here to win applause," he began, his southern drawl steely, every syllable weighted like a loaded chamber. "I'm here to prevent this country from walking off a financial cliff." The room had stilled. No papers rustled. No whispers dared interrupt the mood he had created. Let's stop pretending we can pour endless dollars into a retirement system that's already buckling. The Congressional Budget Office didn't mince words. If entitlement spending stays on its current trajectory, we'll be adding over $1 trillion in annual deficits within the decade. That's not reform. That's recklessness wearing a mask. His voice rose, not in volume, but in urgency. And if we're going to sit here and entertain fantasies about unlimited expansion of benefits without structural reform, then we're not governing. We're hallucinating. He glanced at Jasmine again, this time with narrowed eyes and a clipped smirk. You want to bankrupt the system for a headline, not save it for the future. He drew in a sharp breath, then drove the insult home. Congresswoman, your passion is real, but so is your math problem. And frankly, you talk like someone who's never balanced a checkbook, let alone a nation's budget. A few gasps rippled through the gallery. Jasmine sat motionless, but her stillness was not weakness. It was pressure building. Kennedy's tone turned colder, more clinical. We can't collapse the economy just to satisfy a loud minority who thinks shouting injustice is the same as building policy. His words dripped with condescension, not fire, but ice. This government is not a fantasy factory. It cannot be held hostage by emotion, nor should it be driven by guilt. He stepped back slightly but kept his voice sharp. We owe it to every American, especially the next generation, not to leave them a graveyard of broken promises, collapsed institutions. That's not leadership. That's betrayal dressed in compassion. The room was frozen. Even those who disagreed with him were forced to reckon with the chilling clarity of his message. Kennedy had turned the hearing into a financial battlefield, and now with one brutal swipe at her credibility, he had dared Jasmine Crockett to strike back. The silence screamed for her response. The air was still charged from Kennedy's cold economic ultimatum when Jasmine Crockett stepped back to the microphone. Not shaken, not defensive, but focused like a blade drawn for one purpose. Her silence at first was not weakness, it was precision. She waited just long enough for Kennedy's hard truths to congeal in the minds of the audience like cement. And then she began to chip through them with fire. Senator, she said, her voice steady but razor sharp, what you call fantasy, other nations call policy. And what you call reckless generosity, they call dignity. She let that word sit, dignity, as if daring the room to measure its worth against debt. I'm not standing here asking America to build castles in the sky, she continued, eyes narrowing. I'm asking why the wealthiest nation in the world refuses to learn from the ones who treat their elderly with the respect they deserve. Countries like Denmark and Sweden don't throw their retirees into poverty and call it fiscal discipline. They invest in them. They value them. She paced once as slowly, then turned sharply back to Kennedy. Let's talk numbers since you like them so much. In Sweden, less than 5% of seniors live below the poverty line. In the United States, it's over 23% and rising. So when you say our system is essential, I ask, essential for who? Certainly not the waitress who's worked 40 years on her feet just to retire into desperation. A low audible murmur moved through the room. Denmark's pension system doesn't bankrupt the nation. It strengthens it. It's built on progressive taxation, corporate accountability, and a belief that no one should fear their final years. Meanwhile, here in America, Amazon paid $0 in federal income tax in multiple years. And somehow, we still ask janitors and school bus drivers to bear the weight of our national shame. She leaned forward now, voice rising with conviction. This is not about utopia. It's about courage. Other nations chose equity. We chose excuses. And every time someone like you tells us it's too expensive to care, what you really mean is it's too inconvenient to try. Her final line landed like thunder. We have no shortage of wealth, Senator Kennedy. What we have is a shortage of political will, and you are Exhibit A. The chamber didn't erupt, but it vibrated. Jasmine Crockett had just used international fact, moral clarity, and economic realism to turn Kennedy's cold logic into a hollow echo. And in that silence, a new momentum began to build. One no chart or deficit could hold back. The applause that followed Jasmine's blistering comparison to Nordic models had barely died down when Kennedy leaned forward again, his knuckles pressing into the polished wood of the desk, his eyes burning with a sharpened indignation. The spotlight was back on him, and he intended to reclaim the battlefield. Let's not pretend, he began, voice cutting through the tension like ice through glass, that America can just become Sweden because you've decided to admire their spreadsheets. His tone was low but laced with heat. You want to raise taxes on employers, on businesses, on job creators? You want to turn this country into a machine that punishes productivity just to fund some idealistic pension dream? He straightened, lifting his chin. You're not saving the poor, Congresswoman. You're sabotaging the very economy they depend on. The room stiffened. His next words dropped like hammers. You're proposing to suffocate the private sector just to buy votes from the desperate. You think you're offering justice, but what you're really offering is a death sentence for small businesses who can't survive under your tax and spend delusions. He turned, now speaking directly to the audience and the cameras beyond. If we implement your policies, what happens to the factory owner in Ohio? The family-run diner in Alabama? They're not Amazon, Jasmine. They're barely getting by, and you want to tax them into extinction. That's not equity. That's economic suicide. And then came the venom, cloaked in Southern drawl but tipped with disdain. You talk a lot about compassion, Congresswoman, but compassion without comprehension? That's just chaos in a pretty dress. His voice hardened with finality. If we trade economic freedom for ideological vanity, we will not have a retirement crisis. We will have a national collapse. And I, for one, refuse to let that happen on my watch. The silence that followed wasn't quiet, it was loaded. Kennedy's attack had shifted the tone from numbers and policies to a moral accusation that Jasmine's vision, while noble in speech, would strangle the very country she claimed to protect. And in that silence, the room held its breath, because something volatile had just been ignited. The weight of Kennedy's accusations still echoed faintly across the chamber, but Jasmine Crockett didn't recoil. She absorbed every syllable like flint against steel, silent, steady, and sharpening. And then she rose, not with noise, but with purpose, her presence filling the space as if the walls themselves leaned forward to listen. Her gaze swept the room not for applause, but for accountability. Senator Kennedy, she began, her voice precise and deliberate, you speak of preserving an economy, but which one? The one where hedge fund managers deduct private jet expenses while working mothers ration insulin? The one where corporate giants claim record profits yet pay zero in federal income taxes? That economy may be working for your friends on Wall Street, but it's breaking the backs of those who clean their offices. Her tone sharpened, not theatrical, but surgical. Let's not pretend this is about fiscal responsibility. What we're really discussing is who gets to live with dignity and who doesn't. And time and again, your policies have drawn a line that says, if you're rich, you're protected. If you're poor, you're disposable. A ripple of tension passed through the room as her words grew heavier, grounded in truth and lived reality. You defend a system where workers, people who dig our roads, stock our grocery shelves, care for our elderly, are asked to sacrifice more, save more, endure more. And yet, at the same time, billion-dollar corporations are shielded by subsidies and tax breaks they never needed to begin with. She turned her body slightly toward the cameras now, the millions watching not just a political battle, but a moral one. And still you dare to say we're asking too much? That we're dreaming too big? Senator, what you call economic collapse, I call moral bankruptcy, a system where the rich hoard opportunity while the rest inherit despair. Her voice dropped lower, anchoring the gravity of her final blows. You claim I want to buy votes with compassion, but the truth is you're preserving a class structure with cruelty. The system you protect doesn't just fail the poor, it punishes them. It doesn't just favor the wealthy, it worships them. Then came the line that cracked through the chamber like thunder. The structure you uphold has created a country where the richer you are, the more entitled you are to dignity, and the poorer you are, the more you're expected to earn it in silence. And that, Senator, is not democracy. That is economic feudalism dressed in the language of freedom. For a moment, the room was entirely still. No rebuttal came. No whisper stirred. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice, but she had burned through the silence with something far louder than volume. Unshakable, lived conviction. And the weight of her truth hung there like smoke. Impossible to ignore. Impossible to erase. As the verbal blows between Jasmine and Kennedy echoed through the chamber like cannon fire, A new voice rose, not with ideology, but with undeniable evidence, like a verdict rising from the soul of the people. The silence shattered when Dr. Alicia Mendez, senior economist at the Economic Justice Institute, stood slowly from her seat. Her voice didn't tremble. It rang out, sharp and measured, honed by years of policy battles and cold statistics. "This is no longer just a debate," she said, turning to the dais. "This is a question of truth, and who has the courage to face it?" She raised a report in her hand, marked with the seal of the Social Policy Accountability Bureau. "Our data shows that over 47% of retired Americans today depend solely on Social Security to stay above the poverty line. That's not sustainability. That's survival hanging by a thread." She paused, letting the statement breathe, and then twisted the knife. "And yet we continue to pretend this system is fair, just because it hasn't yet collapsed." Before anyone could respond, Marcus Delaney, president of the National Workers Union, stepped forward. His hands were calloused, his voice full of grit. "I represent over 82,000 laborers, many of them with 35-plus years of service," he said, eyes locked on Kennedy. "They played by the rules. They gave their lives to this economy, and now you're telling them their retirement is a luxury this nation can't afford?" A low murmur moved through the crowd, building into quiet outrage. Delaney's voice rose like a hammer coming down. "You say reform will hurt the economy, but what about the man in Kansas who had to go back to work at 72 because his pension vanished into a hedge fund's bonus pool? Or the widow in Detroit who chooses between food and medication because her Social Security check doesn't cover both?" He turned toward Jasmine, nodding once. "You may be standing alone up there, Congresswoman, but you're not alone out here." Then came the line that pierced the room like lightning. "We cannot keep lying to the American people, telling them this system is working when every damn number says otherwise." Gas rippled through the crowd. Even some on Kennedy's side shifted uneasily in their seats. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. For a moment, it wasn't her voice that carried the cause. It was the truth itself, finally standing on two legs in a room that had too long ignored it. As the final expert testimony faded, replaced by a tense, brittle silence, the hearing room transformed. It no longer resembled a forum for polite discourse. It was now an arena, and Jasmine Crockett was stepping back into the ring. She rose not like a politician, but like someone who had been summoned by a cause bigger than herself. Her jaw tightened, her fingers trembling just slightly. Not with fear, but with fury barely restrained. The folder of data in her hands was no longer a prop. It was a weapon. She fixed her eyes on Kennedy, her voice low at first but burning with purpose. "Enough with the scare tactics. Enough with the doomsday math meant to shut down moral courage. Let's speak the truth plainly." The room held its breath as she stepped forward. "You say we can't afford to reform this system," she continued, each syllable more deliberate, more dangerous. "But what you really mean is, you don't want to, because fixing it means admitting who's been left behind. It means acknowledging that for decades, we've engineered a system where the people who scrub hospital floors, who care for our elderly, who raise children and bury spouses on minimum wage, those people pay in full, while billion-dollar corporations pay nothing." Kennedy raised an eyebrow, but Crockett pressed harder. Her voice, now raw with urgency, cut across the marble chamber. "We keep hearing about sustainability, about debt, about burden. But who carries that burden, Senator? Is it the hedge fund manager in Connecticut? The oil executive from Texas? Or is it the single mother in Mississippi who retires with a fraction of what she needs to survive?" She reached into her folder, lifting a chart that showed it clearly. The top 1% control over $36 trillion in wealth. Meanwhile, 40% of Americans have less than $400 in emergency savings. The numbers struck the room like thunder. But Jasmine didn't need thunder to make her point. Her voice dropped, icy now, coiled with precision. "You are defending a system that rewards inherited power and punishes earned labor. You are preserving a class divide so deep, so institutionalized, that it has become invisible to the very people who built it." She leaned forward, each word a blade. "Mr. Kennedy, you are not protecting America. You are protecting a hierarchy where those at the bottom bleed, while those at the top invest their blood into portfolios. A few murmurs rippled across the room. Jasmine saw them, staffers shifting, cameras refocusing, aides whispering. But she stayed centered, focused, unshakable. Then she struck with her final blow, measured, merciless, and unmistakably personal. You are not just refusing reform. You're refusing to admit that poverty in this country is not an accident. It is a policy choice. And every time you defend the status quo, you choose it again. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. The silence afterward was louder than any shout. The moment teetered on a razor's edge. After an hour of blistering debate, piercing glares, and rising voices, the hearing had become something more than procedural. It had morphed into a battleground for the soul of the country. Jasmine Crockett stood once more, not with anger, but with conviction honed like a blade. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows on her face as she reached for the binder she had placed before her at the start, the one she had saved for this precise moment. The air turned electric again. Every movement felt like a drumbeat. The staffers leaned forward. Camera crews steadied their rigs. Even the reporters stopped typing. And when Jasmine finally spoke, her voice didn't rise. It cut. Senator Kennedy keeps invoking economic doom, she said, her tone ice on steel, as if compassion is some fiscal virus. But let me be clear. What I'm proposing isn't fantasy. It's the future. Her hand moved across the table and flipped open the binder to a colored chart, its title bold and unavoidable. Fair Pension System for a Just America. A system that doesn't rely on squeezing every drop from the backs of minimum wage workers and single mothers. A system where wealth doesn't determine whether you live in comfort or die in poverty. She let the image sink in before driving forward, her voice now gaining tempo. We need comprehensive pension reform that ensures equity, not excuses. That means restructuring our tax code so that billion-dollar corporations like Amazon and ExxonMobil, companies that paid zero federal income tax in multiple years, actually contribute to the nation that allowed them to flourish. That means ensuring women who earn 82 cents to every dollar a man makes and live nearly 6 years longer on average aren't left with 30% less retirement income just because they dared to exist in a system designed without them. The audience murmured again. Jasmine's eyes scanned the room, not to intimidate, but to challenge. Senator Kennedy wants to tighten belts. But ask yourself, whose belts are we cutting? The executives flying private jets to offshore tax havens? Or the nurse in Mississippi working double shifts with arthritis just to make ends meet? Her voice narrowed, sharpened. We've been saving the budget for decades, and every time, it's the same people paying the price. The janitors, the warehouse workers, the elderly women eating cat food because their Social Security checks don't cover rent anymore. Across the room, Kennedy stirred, arms crossed tightly, jaw clenching behind practiced stoicism. Jasmine didn't flinch. And what I'm proposing is not radical. Denmark does it, Sweden does it, Norway does it. These aren't collapsing socialist regimes. They're some of the most resilient economies in the world. They tax wealth fairly. They support their people. They respect labor. And guess what? Her tone turned fierce. They're not drowning in debt. They're thriving. The next slide came up on the screen behind her. A chart comparing elderly poverty rates, US 23%, Sweden 7%, Denmark 6%. We are failing our elders not because we can't afford better, but because we refuse to demand better from those hoarding the most. Then came the turn. But I understand why that makes people uncomfortable, she said, locking eyes with Kennedy, because the moment we change the system, the moment we stop protecting capital at the expense of people, those profiting from the old way have to give something up. She paused just long enough to let the words hang, then delivered the strike. What I'm offering isn't a utopia, it's a correction, a moral course adjustment, a nation where the wealthiest pay their fair share so the rest don't drown in their silence. Kennedy leaned forward now, the silence heavy with his impatience. That's a lovely speech, Congresswoman, he began, each syllable dipped in condescension. But when your plan triggers a hiring freeze across American small businesses, will you stand there and read more charts? Or will you finally understand that bleeding the economy dry to fund your crusade isn't policy, it's delusion? Jasmine didn't blink. You talk about bleeding the economy dry, she said, voice low but razor sharp, but it's been hemorrhaging for decades, just not from the top. It bleeds from broken backs, stolen pensions, and promises that were never meant to be kept. Kennedy bristled. And what you're proposing is what? Tax hikes and fantasies built on Scandinavian snow? He waved a dismissive hand toward the graph. This isn't Europe, Crockett. It's America. And here, we reward hard work, not dependency. She stepped forward, the binder closing with a satisfying thud. Then stop rewarding exploitation and start honoring dignity, because what you call dependency, Senator, is often just survival. After a lifetime of work that built your America, but was never allowed to share in its reward. The room exploded in murmurs and gasps. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The silence was deafening. For a moment, the entire hearing chamber seemed suspended in time. The lights overhead buzzed faintly. The sound of distant camera shutters flicked like nervous ticks across the room. John Kennedy sat back, his mouth drawn into a thin, stubborn line, arms crossed, not in triumph, but in thinly veiled defiance. He had said all he could. He had wielded every number, invoked every fear, and wrapped himself in the armor of fiscal responsibility. But somehow that armor now looked hollow. Then Jasmine Crockett stood. There was no podium, no script in her hands. Just a quiet inhale, then an exhale that carried decades of injustice, generations of struggle, and the burden of a nation's tired patience. Her gaze swept the room, from the congressional aides behind the railings, to the union workers packed shoulder to shoulder in the back, to the C-SPAN camera blinking red in the corner. All of America was watching now, and they weren't just watching a debate, they were watching a reckoning. I've listened to the warnings, Jasmine began, her voice low but steady, about debt, about restraint, about what we supposedly can't afford. But let me tell you what we really can't afford. This silence, this paralysis, this system. She paused, her hands clenched lightly in front of her, as if holding back a wave of fury behind them. We are told to tighten belts while billionaires buy yachts bigger than public libraries. We're told to wait our turn while working mothers in Mississippi die with $27 in their retirement accounts. And we're told that raising a voice is reckless, when the true recklessness is letting a broken system grind down people who've spent their whole lives holding it up. A murmur stirred through the room. The words weren't just rhetoric. They were the stories of nurses, bus drivers, janitors, widows. Jasmine had seen them. She had been raised by them. She continued, now pacing slowly before the bench. The current system, this so-called cornerstone of stability, was never built for everyone. It was built for those who already had something. It punishes those who raise children, who take time off to care for sick parents, who work jobs without 401ks or safety nets. And you want to call this sustainable? Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from sheer pressure. She turned sharply toward Kennedy. You called my vision utopian. You called it dangerous. But what's more dangerous? Asking the ultra-wealthy to pay their share? Or pretending that millions of Americans living off canned soup and borrowed insulin is a price worth paying for economic purity? Kennedy didn't respond. His expression remained stony, but a single muscle in his jaw twitched. Let's talk about the numbers, Jasmine said, voice rising. The United States spends over $877 billion annually on defense. That's more than the next 9 countries combined. Yet somehow we can't find the money to ensure a retired waitress doesn't have to choose between rent and medicine? She stepped forward again. Denmark has a poverty rate among seniors below 6%. Sweden, even lower. Why? Because they tax wealth, not just wages. Because they value dignity over profit. Because they understand that a strong society lifts from the bottom, not props from the top. Her tone sharpened. But we cling to trickle-down fantasies while entire communities drown. And when someone calls it out, when someone like me dares to say enough, we're called divisive, radical, dangerous. Her eyes locked on Kennedy's. Let me be clear. What's radical is a system where Amazon pays zero in federal taxes while kindergarten teachers retire in debt. What's dangerous is a mindset that says sacrifice is noble, but only if it comes from the poor. And what's truly divisive is pretending that protecting corporate wealth is somehow patriotism. The crowd shifted again. Reporters leaned closer. Phones lit up. The hashtag number sign Crockett versus Kennedy was already trending. She raised her voice now, speaking not just to the room, but to every screen tuned in across America. I am not here to appease hedge fund managers or pacify talking points. I am here because the people who clean your offices, who build your roads, who keep your lights on, they deserve better. They've been left behind for too long, and if I'm the only voice in this room who will speak for them, then so be it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was electric. Then one by one, a few experts seated behind the railing began to nod. An economist from the Roosevelt Institute, a labor representative from Ohio, a public pension advocate from Wisconsin. Their voices followed in the form of quiet murmurs to staffers, text messages fired to journalists, and short, sharp statements to media outlets waiting outside. Then came the first burst. A silver-haired labor leader stood, her voice gravelly with age but fierce with purpose, cut across the room. She's right. All heads turned. This country is bleeding out its future, the woman continued, and every time we defend the status quo, we pour salt into the wound. Jasmine Crockett speaks for the people who've been shouted over for generations. Applause followed, small at first, then swelling. Even the journalists, trained to remain detached, exchanged glances of stunned approval. Jasmine remained still, absorbing it all, but not basking. Her next words came slowly with gravity. We don't need perfect, she said. We need better. We need fair. We need a system that understands people are more than just economic liabilities. They are human beings. They deserve dignity, safety, and the promise that after a lifetime of work, they will not be abandoned. Her final line dropped like a gavel strike. We can't keep living in a system where hope is a luxury. We must build one where hope is a right. The standing ovation came like thunder. Even some members of the opposing party shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the tide had turned, not just in the room, but in the nation. John Kennedy, still seated, said nothing, but his silence was louder than any rebuttal. He had delivered warnings. She had delivered a vision. And tonight, America had chosen vision. In the hours that followed, media outlets exploded with headlines. Jasmine Crockett shifts the debate on retirement reform. Kennedy falls silent in wake of fiery Crockett response. A star is born in the fight for economic justice. Pundits argued over the long-term impact. Polls shifted overnight. Unions mobilized. Congressional staffers rewrote drafts of pending bills with her voice echoing in their minds. And somewhere in a rusted-out kitchen in Detroit, an elderly woman watching from her small screen wiped a tear from her cheek. Not because she saw politics change, but because, for the first time in years, she saw someone who remembered she existed. Jasmine Crockett walked out of that chamber not as a footnote to a debate, but as the woman who reminded a weary country that justice was not an ideal. It was a demand, and she would not stop demanding, not now, not ever. And yet, after the final applause faded and the chamber slowly emptied, what lingered was not the roar, but the quiet truth that had anchored every word she spoke. This wasn't just about numbers or policy papers. This wasn't about winning a debate. This was about the people no one saw, the janitor retiring without savings, the widowed mother forced back to work at 72, the nurse who spent a lifetime caring for others only to end up begging Medicaid for a home care stipend. Jasmine Crockett had not just spoken for them, she had become their voice, forged from their struggle, pulsing with their desperation. And in doing so, she revealed the raw nerve of the American experiment, a system that asks so much of its people, then forgets them the moment they can no longer give. The lesson wasn't abstract. It was etched into the lines on the face of the man who delivered mail for 35 years and still couldn't afford to retire. It was baked into the tired bones of the woman who paid into Social Security all her life, only to be told it might not be there for her. Jasmine had exposed that cruelty with surgical precision. But what made it unforgettable was that she did not stop at exposing. She invited the country to care. Because the real crisis, as she made so clear, was not just economic, it was moral. A nation that measures its greatness by GDP, but lets its elders decay in silence, is not wealthy. It's broken. A country that celebrates billion-dollar IPOs but cuts food assistance to aging war veterans is not strong. It's ashamed. Jasmine's fire had burned through the talking points, but in the embers, what remained was something more durable. The conviction that a society should be judged not by how high the richest can rise, but by how far the most vulnerable are allowed to fall. And perhaps that was her quiet genius, not just to call out injustice, but to reframe what justice could look like. Not handouts, not pity, but recognition, the kind that sees value not in stock portfolios, but in lives lived with grit and grace. As she walked down the Capitol steps that night, past reporters, flashing bulbs, and aides scrambling to rewrite their talking points, she paused for just a moment at the sidewalk. There, standing alone, was an elderly woman in a gray windbreaker, holding a handwritten sign that read, "I believed I didn't matter until today." Jasmine smiled, because in the end, the fight wasn't for headlines or hearings. It was for her, and millions like her. That above all was the lesson. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.